So Matthew, sitting at his tax booth, was happily oppressing people till Jesus came along. He loved that feeling when those fishermen would bring in their catch and make their way to his booth and look at him with resentment. He loved staring them down, making them go into submission and hand over those coins. Ooh, I felt that zing. He could get another hit. He just couldn't wait for the next one. It was like, ooh, yeah, yummy. So he felt this, continual hit of that power and control over these people. He thought it was pretty satisfying. There were, always taxes to collect. And then the 10% he always added on top of that tax for himself. He could go on this way for a long time. Ah, yes, he was happily oppressing people till Jesus came along. And then Jesus came along, and he went up to Matthew at his tax booth and looked at him, into him, through him, and something churned inside of Matthew. It would be too noble to say that he recognized that his adding the extra 10% was a problem morally. He really didn't think about that because he spent his whole life rationalizing how he made this money. But what he did feel was suddenly a dissatisfaction, this longing for something that would give him something else more deep, more satisfying than this stack of coins. And he looked at that stack of coins, and they lost their luster for him. And so he looked at Jesus and thought, maybe this man will show me something more satisfying. And so he got up from his tax booth and followed him. And Matthew had no idea how hard that was going to be. But it hit him from the very beginning, because when Jesus brought Matthew in tow to his other disciples, who were fishermen, they looked at Matthew and they're like, "You got to be kidding, right, Jesus? You got to be kidding. This thief is going to join us?" So while they were having a dinner, and other tax collectors heard about this good news of Jesus eating with Matthew, they're like, "Well, we want in." And other sinners came, and of course the Pharisees came, and they're like, And instead of talking to Jesus, they saddle up to the disciples, and they say, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And these fishermen disciples say back, "We have no frickin' clue. We have no frickin' clue. In fact, at this dinner, we're planning to poison Matthew." You have to ask the question every once in a while when reading about Jesus. Why did they want to kill him? Today I want to answer that question by asking another question. Has someone ever told you the truth about yourself and you wanted to kill them. This is what's happening in today's scene in the call of Matthew, when Jesus concludes, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Only the sick need a physician. The well do not need a physician. And the Pharisees probably heard this and said to the disciples, ha, he just called you a sinner. He just called all of you sinners. You're all just like Matthew. I wonder what the disciples thought when they heard Jesus say this. The unrighteous? What? We've spent the first 8 chapters in Matthew thinking we were called because we were worthy. That maybe we were a little better than the rest. That's why we thought we were following you, because you saw some ability here. And now we're being lumped with this guy? The Pharisees were the best. They were the best. Went to synagogue every Saturday, led synagogue, studied the scriptures, obeyed the Torah, tithed 10%, served the poor. They were the best religious people. And they suffered from the occupational hazard of being religious, thinking that they were good enough, maybe a little better than most. And then we have Matthew, who was obviously the worst. He was the worst. And that was his advantage, you see. He was the worst. And Jesus touched him, saw him, and he knew the longing in his heart. And he knew he needed something else besides his own goodness. He couldn't be like the Pharisees, who were so good. He needed grace. He needed a divine physician who would heal them, because he couldn't figure out how to unlatch himself from this need for money. And then now we have the disciples. Do I identify with the Pharisees? Do I identify with Matthew? If I identify with the Pharisees, then I'm good enough. I like being good enough. I like being good. I like telling people how much good I do in this world. Then people will respect me, give me affection and esteem. Or he did call us, and he called sinners the unrighteous. So if we're like Matthew, if I identify with Matthew, then I'm sick and I need healing. Well, I'm not wounded, am I? Am I wounded? I mean, Matthew's the one who looks weak. He never hauls in fish. Am I wounded? Do I need healing? Welcome to discipleship. So often we think of discipleship as going out there doing good and doing all these good things to heal the world and fix the world. But here we hear that discipleship, I call my disciples because they need a physician. I only call those who need healing. So these fishermen disciples must make a judgment call. Do they see themselves as sinners in need of healing, or as people who are good and can stand on their own goodness. This is the perfect time for ordinary time. Ordinary time. We just switched over, everything got green, and it means this long growing season till Advent. We have this time, this long time, to consider what it means to grow into discipleship, grow into understanding of what the call really means, how much self-examination it actually involves to be a disciple, not just to do good works, but to be transformed within. And that perhaps this is all a part of not just the transforming of myself, but my relationships, and not just that, the world. That is what we are about now in ordinary time, living into the fullness of our discipleship. So I'm going to take a long treatment for a lot of ordinary time to talk about this internal transformational work. I'm going to be following the teachings of Thomas Keating, the great contemplative monk who guides many through this internal transformation so that we can each find healing, not only within ourselves, but in our relationships. And that, in fact, this is so critical that it is part of the work of transforming the world. So for those of you who like to be busy, this is going to be a lot less busy on the outside, but on the inside, we're going to go deep within. Oftentimes we think of the Christian development as an ascent, but I want us to go into a descent. In the green growing time, in order for things to be planted, we need to dig into the earth, the humus, what makes us human. Dig and look at the creepy, crawly things there and go, is that in here? And if it is, what does God want for me with my creepy, crawly things? So the first teaching of Thomas Keating is around this thing called emotional centers. Emotional centers. They are instinctual centers for survival, and they are all in place before we are 2 years old. We are born with a need, especially the oldest center is safety and security. That is so obvious. We're born with that need because human beings are born way too early. They need to be 2 years in the womb. Right? For those of you who gave birth, what do you think, 2 years? So, because when we're born, we're so vulnerable. And the instant you're born, you have that instinct to survive, to seek safety and security. And the next instinct is to seek affection and esteem. And once you kind of get a sense that you have a body separate from your environment, you will seek power and control. Those are the three energy centers: safety and security, esteem and affection, power and control. How many of you have all those satisfied? You're like, oh yeah, I'm good. The reality is, this is called the human condition. The reality is, in each of these centers, we will find frustration from not having them fulfilled. And if you are before the age of 12 and you suffered some very marked frustrations in these three energy centers of safety and security, esteem and affection, power and control, you will have two possible responses to a frustrated need. The first is to seek after the symbols in the culture that represent that need for safety, security, esteem and affection, power and control. Or the pain will be so intense, you will repress it. And you don't know what happened, but you will retain the emotion around that. So so the two scenarios is, in the first one where you seek after the cultural symbols that satisfy, for instance, a need for safety and security. What could that look like? What would be a symbol out there of safety and security? Money, maybe? For some people, it might be money. It could be that's what Matthew was. Money actually represents every one of these energy centers. That's why money is so interesting. If I have enough money, then I'll be safe. If I have enough money, people will respect me. If I have enough money, I can have power and control over my environment and people, right? Money represents every one of those. But we have other symbols. So you can seek after the symbols, or you can repress it, the pain, but somewhere along the line as you're in your, after 12 years old, something happens and you find yourself having this spike of emotion. Like, someone taking your parking spot or something, and you're like, that person needs to die. Okay, that's what we call intensity. A little too much. Those emotions, if you track them back, it will go back to an energy center. And you might not know what caused that deep need for whatever feeling you had around that parking spot. But that emotion is around, is it esteem and affection? Is it power and control? Is it safety and security? So these are the two ways we react. We either chase after the symbols that we think will give us what we were lacking in that energy center, or we will repress it and then out of nowhere find ourselves behaving and feeling so strongly about something, and it's taking us. It's taking us on an emotional binge. Give me more of that poison, yeah. Right? So this is called the emotional centers, and each one of us sits in all three. But there's usually one that we sit on more often than another. So today, I want you to go home or at coffee hour. We actually talked about it at coffee hour. I was kind of proud of the 8 o'clockers, willing to share, like, which energy center do you sit on most often? When you find things trigger you, where do you go? Do you tend to retract and recede and go into safety? Or do you, I'm just going to get another degree and then people will respect me, or I'm going to do all these other things and sing and dance and people will be like, you're so great? Or do I go, you need to change and you need to do this and you need to do everything in order for me to be happy? That, by the way, does not work. No one will ever do everything you want them to do, right? That's a recipe for unhappiness. But we all go through these things. And this is also what's happening in the gospel reading today. People are getting triggered. And the invitation is, come and be healed. Come and experience grace. But first, you must say, I need it. First, you must know you have an injury. First, say yes. And some won't. The Pharisees generally won't. They're fine. What about you? This is discipleship. What about you? Do you have a need, a longing for healing, for freedom from this emotional programming that kind of yanks you in directions you don't even really want to go, and yet you're just like, I got to go there. And you have a hard time resisting it. So this is what we're going to go through in our series, where we consider how all this works and what Thomas Keating's methods are for helping us unlatch ourselves from our emotional programming so that we can be healed and we can be free. And that is gospel. Amen.